Have you ever tried to think your way out of a feeling? I mean, really tried. You sit there and replay the conversation. You analyze what happened. You think about what you should have said. You imagine what you might say next. You worry about something that hasn't even happened yet. And you keep thinking and thinking and thinking, as though somewhere inside your mind, there's one perfect thought that's finally going to make you feel better. But instead, you just get more tired. And the strange thing is, your body has been sitting there with you the entire time. Your shoulders tight, your jaw clenched, breathing a little shallower than usual. Maybe your leg is bouncing. Maybe you're restless. Maybe you feel that heaviness that comes when you've been inside your own head for too long. And what if, in that moment, the answer isn't another thought? What if you don't need to figure anything out? What if you need to move? Sometimes the mind doesn't need another conversation. Sometimes the body needs somewhere to go. And that's what we're talking about today. Welcome back, everybody, to the Soul Talk podcast. I'm Mary Beth Rim. We have conversations about the connection between our minds, our bodies, and our spirit and our emotional well-being, and the way we actually live our lives. Last week, we started with a pretty simple idea. We were made to move, not exercise. Move. See, there's a difference, because when I say exercise, most of us immediately start thinking about workouts, running, going to the gym, strength training, miles, minutes, heart rate, calories, steps, performance. But movement existed long before any of those things. Human beings walked. We carried things. We climbed. We reached. We bent. We gathered. We played. We danced. We moved towards one another. Movement wasn't something squeezed into a 30-minute window before work. It was woven into being alive. And somewhere along the way, we started separating movement from life. Now we sit most of the day, and then we're told we need to go somewhere specifically designed for movement so we can get our exercise. When you really think about it, it's kind of interesting. We've taken something incredibly natural and made it feel like an obligation. And I think we've done something else too. We've made movement almost entirely about the body. We talk about what movement does for our heart, our muscles, our bones, our weight, our blood pressure, our endurance. And yes, those things matter. But what I want to talk about today is something I think every bit as important. What does movement do to the mind? Because movement isn't only physical. And if you've ever gone for a walk when you were upset, you already know that. And if you've ever stepped outside after sitting at your desk for hours and thought, oh my goodness, I needed this. You know, if you've ever started a run with your mind going in 100 different directions and finished feeling calmer, you know. If you've ever put music on while you were cleaning the house and suddenly realized your entire mood had changed, you know. We experience this all the time. We just don't always recognize it as medicine. And before we go further, if these conversations around movement, mindfulness, mental health, and what it means to live well resonate with you, I'd really love for you to subscribe to my Soul Talk podcast. It helps this podcast and channel continue to grow But more importantly, it lets you come back each week and continue these conversations with me. Because I don't want this series to be about telling you that you need to exercise more. There are plenty of people on the internet who can do that. That's not what we're here doing. I want us to rethink our relationship with movement altogether. Because for many people, the relationship isn't particularly good. Think about some of the language we've learned around exercise. I have to work out. I need to burn this off. I was bad this weekend. I didn't do enough. I missed my workout. I only walked. I only did 20 minutes. I should be doing more. Listen to those words. Have to. Need to. Should. Only. There's so much judgment wrapped around something our bodies were naturally designed to do. And I think that's one of the reasons people stop moving. Because movement stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like another place where we're failing. If you didn't run far enough, it didn't count. If you didn't sweat enough, it didn't count. If your heart rate wasn't high enough, it didn't count. If you didn't lose weight, apparently it didn't work. And I don't believe that. I think that we've made movement far too small by defining it only through fitness. Because movement can do something that doesn't show up on the scale. It can change the way you feel inside your own life and your own skin. I know this professionally, but I also know this personally. I mean, again, I've spent 30 years working in mental health, and so much of mental health is understandably centered around talking. We sit, we talk, we process, we explore, we try to understand, we look at patterns, we make connections, we ask questions. And that work can be and is incredibly important. But after all those years and after all the years that I've spent running, walking, strength training, practicing yoga, meditation, and simply living in my own body and my own skin, I've become increasingly interested in something else. There are moments where insight isn't what we need. You already know why you're upset. You already know that you're stressed. You already know you're overthinking. You already know that conversation bothered you. You already know you're worried. Understanding isn't necessarily the problem. The question becomes, what do I do with what I'm feeling? And sometimes the answer starts in the body. I can't tell you how many times I've had something on my mind and gone out for a run or walk. And here's the funny part. I didn't necessarily go out there to work through anything. I wasn't saying, okay, mile 1, let's deal with my feelings. I just moved. And somewhere along the way, something changed. Maybe the problem didn't disappear. Maybe I still didn't have an answer. Maybe the situation waiting for me when I got home was exactly the same, but I wasn't exactly the same. That's the part I find so interesting, because the circumstances hadn't changed, but my internal experience of them had. Maybe I had a little more perspective. Maybe I wasn't quite as reactive. Maybe something that felt enormous before the walk didn't feel quite as enormous afterward. Maybe I suddenly knew what I wanted to say. Or maybe I simply felt calmer. And sometimes that's enough. We don't have to solve our entire lives every time we put on a pair of shoes. Sometimes feeling 5% better is meaningful. Sometimes being able to breathe a little deeper is meaningful. And sometimes getting out of the room you've been sitting in all afternoon is meaningful. And sometimes looking up at the sky instead of down at your phone is meaningful. And sometimes feeling your feet underneath you again is meaningful. See, sometimes movement simply reminds you that you're here. It doesn't have to be running. I really want to emphasize that throughout this series because personally, I love running. Running has been an enormous part of my life for quite some time. But movement isn't running. Movement might be walking your dogs, gardening, swimming, yoga, stretching while you're watching TV, even folding your laundry, riding a bike, dancing in your kitchen, playing with your kids, your grandkids, walking through a park, taking the stairs, and just getting up from your desk and walking around the building, putting on music and cleaning the house. And yes, sometimes it's a workout, but sometimes it's just moving because you're a human being with a body that wasn't designed to spend its entire life in a chair. And maybe that's where we start. Not how much exercise am I getting, but how much am I actually moving? And then an even more interesting question, how do I feel when I move? Because I think when we start paying attention to that question, we begin to notice something. I know the past couple of weeks, my dad, who's 90, hasn't been feeling all that great. And he told my mom she was baking cookies in the kitchen. And she told him to go lie down. And he's like, but when I get up and move, I feel better. That right there is a statement. Again, what changes when you move? Our thoughts change. Our energy changes. Our breathing changes. Our attention changes. And sometimes our mood changes. Sometimes the story we're telling ourselves even begins to change. And that's not accidental. There's something happening when the body begins to move. Movement gives all that restless energy somewhere to go. You don't want to know why? Because it interrupts the loop. It brings us back into sensation. Feet hitting the ground, arms swinging, breath moving, air against our skin, the world around us. Suddenly, we're not experiencing life only through thought. We're back inside the body. And maybe you've experienced this without ever putting words around it. You've been sitting there frustrated and suddenly thought, I need to go for a walk. Why? Why do we say that? We don't usually say, I need to sit here another 45 minutes and think harder, right? Something inside us knows, get up, go outside, move. And 10 minutes later, you may still be frustrated. That's okay. But something has shifted. There's more space, more perspective, maybe even a little bit of relief. And that's where I want to go next. Because if stress isn't just something we think, if we actually experience stress through the body, then movement may be doing far more than simply strengthening our muscles or burning calories. Movement may be changing our state. Once you understand that, you begin to look at that simple walk around the block very differently. Because think about what happens when you're stressed. And I don't mean huge life-changing stress. I'm talking about ordinary, everyday human stress that we all go through. You're running late. Somebody sends you an email that hits you the wrong way. You're worried about someone that you love. You have too much to do and not enough time to do it. You're waiting for an answer. You're frustrated with something at work. Or maybe there's absolutely nothing you can point to, but you just feel off. You know those days. Nothing is necessarily wrong and nothing feels quite right either. And what's interesting is that we tend to describe all of these things as though they're happening entirely in our minds, in our head. I'm stressed. I'm overwhelmed. I'm anxious. I'm frustrated. I'm worried. But where do you actually feel those things? In your body. Stress isn't just a thought because your shoulders tighten, your breathing changes, your jaw clenches. Your stomach might feel different. Maybe your heart beats a little faster. Maybe you feel restless. And maybe you can't sit still. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you feel heavy, tired, drained, like you don't want to move at all. The body is participating in the experience, which means it makes sense that sometimes the body can participate in the changing the experience too. And I think that's such an important shift in how we think about mental well-being, because we're very accustomed to asking, what am I thinking? What does this mean? Why do I feel this way? And those can be helpful questions. But sometimes there's another question worth asking. What does my body need right now? Maybe it needs rest. Absolutely. There are times when rest is exactly what we need. But sometimes it needs movement. And I think most of us intuitively know this. Have you ever been on the phone during a difficult conversation and suddenly realized you're pacing around the office or pacing around the house? You didn't plan it. You didn't say, I'm going to incorporate some physical activity into this conversation. You just started walking back and forth, room to room. Why? Something in your body wanted movement. Or think about when you're waiting for important news. People pace. When we're excited, we move. When children are happy, what do? They jump up and down. They run. They wiggle. They dance. They don't say, I'm experiencing joy right now, so I should sit quietly and reflect on it. No, they don't say that. They express it through their bodies. Movement and emotion have always been connected. We just tend to forget that as adults, we learn to sit still, control ourselves, hold it together, keep going. And then we wonder why sometimes we feel like we're carrying so much inside. I want to really clear something up here. I'm not saying that if you're struggling emotionally, you should just go exercise and everything will be fine. That's not how human beings work. And again, having spent so many years in mental health, I would never reduce someone's anxiety, depression, grief, trauma, or emotional pain to just go for a walk. Sometimes we really need help. Sometimes we need someone to talk to. Sometimes we need professional care. And sometimes we need medication. Sometimes we need rest. Sometimes life is just genuinely hard. And again, movement does not erase that, but movement is one tool available to us. And I think we've underestimated that, because when we begin moving, several things can happen at once. Your attention has somewhere else to go. Your breathing may begin to find rhythm. You're receiving sensory information from the world around you. Your muscles are working. Your heart is working. Your brain is responding to the activity. And suddenly, you're not just sitting inside the thought anymore. You're having an experience, and that's different. One of the biggest things that I notice when I move is that my thoughts begin to loosen. That's probably the best way I can describe it. They loosen. Because when I'm sitting and thinking about something, my mind can become very focused on one particular story. This happened, then this happened. This person said this. I should have said that. What if this happens? What if that happens? You know the loop. And the more you sit there thinking about it, the more convincing the loop becomes. And it's almost like your mind says, don't worry, we're going to solve this. And then proceeds to play the same 4 thoughts for the next hour. That's rumination. And rumination can feel productive because we're thinking so much. But thinking a lot isn't necessarily the same thing as solving something. Sometimes we're just circling. And movement can interrupt that circle. Not because we're forcing ourselves to stop thinking, but because your attention begins expanding. You're walking and there's a bird. There's a car going by. There's a breeze. There's the feeling that your feet hitting the ground. There's your breathing. There's somebody walking a dog. Maybe there's sunlight coming through the trees. The world starts getting bigger again. And I love that. Because when we're stressed or overwhelmed, our internal world can become very small. It's just the problem. The problem. The problem. The problem. Then you step outside. And suddenly there's a whole world happening around you. The problem is still there. But now there's also a sky. There's air. There's movement. There's sound. There's life happening. And maybe for a few moments, your mind remembers that the problem isn't the entirety of your existence. And that's powerful. And it's also extremely simple. We're always looking for complicated answers. Maybe I need another app, another program, another productivity system, another book, another podcast. And yes, I realize the irony of saying that while you're listening to this podcast, but sometimes the answer is much simpler. Get up and open the door. Walk. Not because walking is going to solve all of your problems today, or it's not going to really solve everything, but because movement can change the state you're trying to solve the problem from. And that's different. Think about that for a moment. Maybe you don't need to immediately solve the problem. Maybe you need to change your state before you decide what the problem requires. Because when we're highly frustrated, overwhelmed, or emotionally activated, we don't always see things clearly. Matter of fact, we don't see anything clearly because everything feels so urgent. Everything feels personal. Everything feels enormous. And then we move, we breathe, we give ourselves 20 minutes. And suddenly, okay, maybe I don't need to respond to that email right now. Have you ever written an email when you were angry? Oh, I've written them. I just recommend not sending it. You can write it, but don't send it. Get up and walk first. Then come back and reread it. Because there's something about physical movement that can create just enough distance between the feeling and what we do with the feeling. And that little bit of space can matter enormously. I think running has taught me this over and over again. There have been plenty of times when I've started to run carrying something really heavy and something mentally, a worry, a frustration, a decision, something I'm trying to figure out. And sometimes I spend the first mile still thinking about it, maybe the second mile too. But then something happens. The rhythm starts taking over. Step, 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 breath, step, 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 breath. And eventually I'm not trying so hard to solve anything. I'm just running. And strangely, that's often when something becomes clearer. Maybe an answer comes, maybe it doesn't. Sometimes the realization is simply, this isn't as big as I thought it was. Or, I can't control this. Or I know what I need to do. Or sometimes I'm tired and I need to stop thinking about this. That's an answer too. And you absolutely do not need to run to experience this. Walking also has rhythm. Cycling has rhythm. Swimming has rhythm. Yoga has rhythm. Even something as simple as stretching and breathing has rhythm. Human beings respond to rhythm. And there's something soothing about giving the body a repetitive action. One foot, then the other. One breath, then the next. You don't need to know where your life is going. You just need to know where your next footstep is going. And maybe that's one reason movement can feel so grounding when life feels so uncertain. Because uncertainty lives in the future. What if? What happens next? What if this doesn't work? What if they say no? What if things change? What if? What if? But your body's right here. This foot, this breath, this step, this moment. There's something incredibly stabilizing about that. And you're bringing yourself back into something you can actually experience. And movement also gives us something else that I think is really important. A sense of forward motion. Think about how often we use physical language to describe emotional experiences. I'm stuck, can't move forward. I feel like I'm going backward, trying to get through this. I don't know which direction to go. We use movement, language constantly because somehow movement and our sense of progress are deeply connected. And when you're feeling stuck emotionally, there's something quietly powerful about physically moving forward. Again, it doesn't magically solve the problem, but your body is experiencing something your mind may desperately need to remember. I can move one step, then another, then another. I don't need the entire map. I don't need to know exactly what's coming 6 months from now. I don't need to know exactly what I'm going to do tomorrow. Right now, the present moment, I can take this step and then this one. I think that's one of the reasons running and walking have meant so much to me over the years. Yes, there's a physical part. There's races, there's goals, there's finish lines, there's medals, and all of that can be fun. But the deeper relationship I have with movement has very little to do with medals. Movement has been a place where I've met myself when I was strong, when I was tired, when I was frustrated, when I was uncertain, when I was excited, when life was going beautifully, and when life felt incredibly complicated. My body was there. And movement gave me a way to stay connected to it. That's why I don't want this series to become another conversation about how much exercise we're supposed to get. I want it to be about something much more human. What happens when we move? What happens to your mood? What happens to your thoughts? What happens to your energy? What happens to your relationship with yourself? And maybe most importantly, what happens when we stop treating the body like something we're constantly trying to control and start treating it like something we can actually listen to? Because that's where this conversation changes again. Movement isn't always about pushing. It isn't always about doing more. It isn't always about getting stronger or faster or going farther. Sometimes movement is information. Sometimes the way your body moves or doesn't want to move is telling you something. And maybe the next question isn't, how hard can I push my body today? Maybe it's, what is my body asking for today? And learning the difference between those two questions can completely change the way we move. And learning the difference between those two questions can completely change the way we move. Because for most of my life, and I think this is true for a lot of us, movement was something we were taught to do to the body. Push it, train it, change it, make it stronger, make it smaller, make it faster, make it look different. Keep going, don't quit. No pain, no gain. We've heard these messages forever. And some of them have their place. There are absolutely moments when we discover something about ourselves by doing something, very difficult. I've experienced that many times through running. There are days when my mind says, okay, we're done. And my body actually has a little more to give. And sometimes continuing teaches me something. It reminds me that discomfort doesn't always mean stop. It reminds me that I can do difficult things. It reminds me that I'm stronger than the voice in my head telling me I can't. But, and this is a really important but, there are also times when pushing isn't strength. Sometimes listening is strength. That's something I've had to learn. And honestly, I think it's something I'm still learning. Because when you're someone who moves, when you're a runner, when you're somebody who sets goals, you get very good at pushing. You get very good at saying, come on, keep going, one more mile, one more interval, one more workout, one more race. You learn discipline, you learn persistence. You learn how to keep going when something is difficult. Those are wonderful qualities until we stop believing the answer is always the push. Because the body doesn't always need to be pushed. Sometimes the body needs to be heard. And that's a completely different skill. I think about this differently now than I did when I was younger. When we're younger, we can sometimes get away with ignoring the body. Didn't sleep enough, keep going. Sore, keep going. Tired, have another cup of coffee and keep going. Although if you know me, I don't drink coffee, but you understand what I mean. We override, and we get very good at overriding. We live in a culture that actually celebrates that. How often do you hear someone proudly say, I only slept 4 hours last night, or I haven't taken a day off in weeks, or I worked through lunch again? And sometimes we've turned ignoring the body into evidence that we're dedicated. But eventually the body has something to say about that. And as I've gotten older, I've developed a much greater respect for that conversation. Because I still want to move. I still want to run. And I still want to challenge myself. I still have goals. I still want adventures. Still want finish lines. But I also want a relationship with my body that allows me to keep doing those things. And that requires me to listen. Maybe you've experienced this. You planned a workout. It's written on the calendar. Today is the day you're supposed to run or strength train or cycle, whatever it is. And you wake up and your body says, nope. And immediately the mind gets involved. Come on, don't be lazy. You said you were going to do this. You're making excuses. You'll feel guilty if you don't. And sometimes the mind is right. Sometimes we're just not motivated. We've had those days. And sometimes getting started is exactly what we need. But other times the body has given us information. Maybe you didn't sleep well. Maybe you've been under enormous stress. Maybe something hurts. Maybe you're recovering. Maybe you've been doing too much. Maybe what your body needs today isn't a 5-mile run. Maybe it needs a walk. Maybe it needs yoga. Maybe it needs just 20 minutes of stretching or meditation. Maybe it needs to move just gently. And maybe, and just maybe, it needs to rest. Rest is also a part of movement. And I know that sounds contradictory. But if we're going to talk about movement as medicine, then we also have to understand dosage. More medicine isn't always better. Sometimes the right amount is the right amount. And I think that's such an important conversation, especially because exercise culture can become very focused on more. More steps, more miles, more weight, more intensity, more days, more effort. But more isn't automatically better. Sometimes better is better. Sometimes consistency is better. And sometimes enjoyment is better. Sometimes walking instead of running is better. Sometimes stopping before you're completely depleted is better. And sometimes doing nothing is exactly what allows you to move again tomorrow. That's not weakness. That's relationship. And that's what I want us to start talking about. What is your relationship with movement? Not your workout routine, not your pace, not how many steps you watch says you took yesterday. Your relationship with it. When you think about moving your body, what comes up? Joy, freedom, curiosity, or guilt, obligation, punishment, embarrassment, comparison. Maybe it's complicated. For a lot of people it is. Maybe somewhere along the way, movement became connected to weight. Maybe it became connected to how you looked. Maybe gym class made you feel like you weren't athletic. Maybe someone made a comment about your body. Maybe you decided very early in life, I'm just not an athlete. And you've carried that sentence around for decades. I'm not athletic. I'm not coordinated. I'm not a runner. I hate exercise. And maybe you don't hate, but you don't hate movement. Maybe you hate what movement became. That's different. Maybe you hate being judged. Maybe you hate feeling like you're being measured. Maybe you hate gyms. I know I do. I have my own gym. Maybe you hate competition. Maybe you hate someone telling you that your body needs to change. That doesn't mean you hate movement. Maybe you love walking. Maybe you love being in the water. Maybe you love gardening or dancing or hiking. Maybe you love riding your bike through the neighborhood. Maybe you love stretching quietly in your living room. Movement doesn't belong to athletes. It belongs to human beings. And I think that's something worth reclaiming. I've done a lot of races in my life. Half marathons, 5Ks, 10Ks, you name it. And yes, I'm proud of those finish lines. But the older I get, I the more I realize that the mental isn't really the important part. The relationship is. The fact that I can put on my shoes and go outside. The fact that I can feel my feet underneath me. The fact that my body continues to teach me. Some days it teaches me strength. Some days it teaches me patience. Some days it teaches me humility. Running is very good at that one. Some days it teaches me that I can do more than I thought. And some days it says, Mary Beth, today we're just walking. And learning to respect both of those messages has changed my relationship with movement. Because my body isn't a machine. It's something I can endlessly demand performance from. It's where I live. Think about that. Your body is the one place you will live for your entire life. From your first breath to your last. It's been there through everything, every heartbreak, every celebration, every loss, every accomplishment, every ordinary day when absolutely nothing remarkable happened. Your body carried you through all of it. And yet, how often do we speak to our bodies as though they're disappointing us? Why can't you do this anymore? Why do you look like this? Why are you tired? Why are you hurting? Why aren't you faster? Why aren't you thinner? Why aren't you stronger? What if we change the conversation? What if instead of constantly asking, what's wrong with my body, we started asking, what is my body telling me? That's a much more compassionate question. And it's also a much more useful one. Because movement can become a form of communication. You start walking and realize, wow, I'm really tired. That's information. You start running and realize I automatically feel fantastic today. That's information. You stretch and notice how much tension you're carrying in your shoulders. That's information. You go outside and 10 minutes later realize your mood has completely changed. That's information. You move and suddenly recognize how stressed you've been. It's information. The body is talking all the time. Movement simply gives us another way to hear it. And I think that's where movement and mindfulness meet. Because mindfulness isn't only sitting quietly with your eyes closed. Mindfulness is attention. It's noticing. And movement gives us so much to notice. How does my body feel today? How am I breathing? Or am I holding tension? Am I pushing because it feels good to challenge myself? Or because I'm afraid that slowing down means I've failed? Do I need intensity? Do I need gentleness? Do I need movement? Do I need rest? There's no universal answer. That's the point. The answer changes because you change. Your body today isn't exactly the body you had yesterday. And it certainly isn't the body you had 20 years ago. And I don't think that's something we need to mourn every single day. I think it's something we learn to work with, because aging doesn't mean the end of movement. It may mean the relationship changes. Maybe the pace changes. Maybe recovery changes. Maybe what feels good changes. But movement can remain part of our lives for a very long time when we're willing to adapt. And there's something incredibly empowering about that. Not trying to recreate the body you had at 30, but discovering what the body you have today is capable of. Or what if that became the goal? Not, can I still do what I used to do? But what can I do now? What feels good? What feels strong now? What feels alive now? That's a conversation I'm much more interested in. Because movement isn't supposed to keep us chasing a younger version of ourselves. Movement can help us inhabit the person we're becoming. And when we begin moving that way, something else starts happening. Movement stops being something we have to earn. It stops being punishment. It stops being another measurement of whether we're good enough. And it stops becoming something much simpler. a way to participate in our own lives, a way to feel ourselves here, a way to say, I'm still here, I'm still moving, I'm still curious, I'm still becoming, still alive. And maybe that's the question underneath this entire episode. What if movement was never primarily about changing your body? What if movement was about experiencing your life through your body? Because when we start looking at it that way, the goal isn't to move because there's something wrong with us. We move because there's something wonderfully human about being able to move at all. And that brings us back to where we started. Your body was never meant to be still. Not because you're supposed to be exercising every minute of the day, but because movement is one of the ways we experience being alive. And maybe that's the medicine. Not punishment, not perfection, not another thing you have to accomplish. Just an invitation to move. And notice what comes alive when you do. And maybe that's where I want to leave you today, not with another exercise prescription, not with a number of steps you're supposed to take, not with a certain number of minutes you need to work out this week, and definitely not with another reason to feel guilty about what you haven't done. So I want to leave you with something much simpler. Move because you can. Move because you're here. Move because your body is part of this life you're living. Move because there's a world outside your front door. Move because sometimes your mind needs a change of scenery. Move because your lungs want fresh air. Move because your feet were made to take you places. Move because there aren't still places you haven't seen, people you haven't met, roads you haven't walked, experience you haven't had, and versions of yourself you haven't discovered yet. Move because you're alive. And please hear me when I say this. I'm not talking about becoming a runner. I'm not trying to convince you to sign up for any marathons. Although, I have to admit, I wouldn't necessarily discourage you, but that's not the point. You don't need a race. You don't need a gym membership. You don't need expensive equipment. You don't need the perfect shoes. You don't need to wait until Monday. You don't need January 1st. You don't need to lose 10 pounds first. You certainly don't need to become a different person before you're allowed to begin. You just need to find a way to move that feels like you. Maybe that's walking, maybe it's swimming, cycling, yoga, dancing, gardening, hiking, strength training. Maybe it's running. Maybe it's putting on music in your kitchen and moving for the length of one song. There isn't one correct way to be moving. You're a human being. That's the beauty of it. Your movement can belong to you. And I think you need to reclaim that because we've turned movement into an industry. You've turned it into numbers, calories, miles, pace, heart rate, steps, weight, before pictures, after pictures, and somewhere inside all those measurements, we can forget the experience. What does it feel like to move? What does it feel like when we're sitting inside all day and you step outside? What does it feel like when the sun hits your face? What does it feel like when your breathing starts finding rhythm? What does it feel like when your legs begin carrying you forward? What does it feel like when you suddenly realize, I'm not thinking about that anymore? Maybe only for 5 minutes, but sometimes 5 minutes is enough to remind you that your thoughts aren't the entire world. There's a body underneath those thoughts. There's life happening around you. There's a present moment available to you. And movement can bring you back into it. That's why I keep coming back to this phrase. Movement is medicine. Not medicine because it cures everything. It doesn't. Not medicine because movement guarantees happiness. It doesn't. And not medicine because you can outrun grief, anxiety, disappointment, stress, difficult parts of being human. You can't. Believe me. If we could outrun our problems, runners would be the most emotionally uncomplicated people on earth. And I can assure you we are not. But movement can give us somewhere to meet those experiences. Sometimes movement gives us perspective. Sometimes it gives us clarity. Sometimes it gives us energy. Sometimes it gives us confidence. And sometimes it gives us a release. And sometimes it simply gives us 20 minutes when we're not trying to figure everything out. And sometimes movement reminds us of our own strength. I think that's one of the greatest gifts movement has given me. Not speed, certainly not speed. Not medals, not race photos, not finished times. Movement has shown me over and over again that I can keep going. Not endlessly, not recklessly, not without rest, but one step at a time. And that's a lesson that extends far beyond running, because life rarely gives us the entire road. Usually, we only get the next step. We don't know exactly what's going to happen next year. Sometimes we don't know what's going to happen next week. We don't know how every relationship is going to turn out. We don't know how every problem will resolve. We don't know which plan will work. We don't know which doors will open. And if we wait until we have certainty before we move, we may be waiting a very long time. Movement teaches us something different. You don't need to see the entire road to take the next step. If you've ever walked early in the morning when it's still dark, you understand this. You don't see miles ahead of you. You see what's right in front of you, and that's enough. You step into what you can see. Then you go a little farther, and you can see a little more. Then you take another step. That's life. We want the whole map. We want guarantees. We want to know where we're going. We want to know it's going to work out. And sometimes we just don't get that. Sometimes all we get is here today. Well, what are you going to do with it? Maybe today you move. Not because you're trying to become someone else, but because you want to spend a little time with the person you already are. Maybe you leave the headphones home. Maybe you put the phone in your pocket. Maybe you don't track the walk. Maybe you don't worry about your pace. Maybe you simply step outside. Look around, breathe, walk. And ask yourself, how do I feel right now? Not how should I feel? Not how do I wish I feel? How do I actually feel? And then just keep walking. 5 minutes later, ask again. Maybe nothing's changed. That's okay. Maybe everything didn't magically become wonderful. That's okay too. But perhaps your breathing is a little different. Perhaps your shoulders have dropped. Perhaps the thought that was circling your mind isn't quite as loud. But maybe you notice something beautiful that you would have missed inside the house. Maybe you smile at someone walking past you. Hear the birds. Feel that warm sun. And then you realize, I needed this. That's the experiment I want you to try this week. And I'm deliberately calling it an experiment, not a challenge, not a workout, not another commitment, an experiment. The next time you feel stuck, move. The next time you're overthinking, move. The next time you've been starting at a screen too long, move. The next time you feel restless, move. Next time you're having a great day, move then too. Don't make movement something you only turn to when something is wrong. Let movement become part of who you are and celebrate being alive. And start small. Start really, really small. Walk to your mailbox. Walk around the block. Stretch for 5 minutes. Put on your favorite song. Take your dog outside. Stand barefoot in the grass and move your body a little. Do something that reminds you, I have a body. I am here, and today I get to use it. I think sometimes we're waiting for motivation before we move. We say, when I feel motivated, I'll start. But motivation is unreliable. It comes, it goes. Some mornings I feel incredibly motivated. And other mornings, the bed makes a very compelling argument. So don't wait for some magical feeling. Make the beginning so small that motivation isn't required. Put your shoes on. That's it. Step outside. That's enough. Listen, you moved, it counted. And maybe your body says, let's keep going. Then just keep going. Not because you're punishing yourself, not because you have something to prove, but because something inside you is beginning to wake up. And that is what I hope you take away from today's conversation. Your body isn't a project. It's not something you have to spend your entire life fixing. It's not an inconvenience standing between you and the life you want. Your body is how you experience the life you have. Through this body, you hug someone you love. Through this body, you feel the sun. Through this body, you laugh, you breathe, you travel. You hold someone's hand. You play, you work, you rest, you grieve, you celebrate. You walk through difficult seasons. You stand at starting lines. You cross finish lines. You begin again and again and again. So maybe movement isn't really about exercise at all. Maybe movement is a way of saying yes. Yes to this body. Yes to this day. Yes to being here. Yes to finding out what might be possible. And if you're listening to this right now and thinking, I really should start moving again, don't turn that thought into guilt. Turn it into an invitation. Don't promise yourself 5 days a week. Don't tell yourself you're going to completely change your life starting tomorrow. Don't make some enormous plan. When this episode ends, stand up. That's it. Stand up. Roll your shoulders back. Take a deep breath. And if you're able, walk outside. You don't have to go far. You don't need to go fast. You don't need to prove anything. Just one step. And then another. And another. Let your body find its rhythm. Let your mind come along for the ride and see where your feet take you. Because maybe the life you're trying so hard to think your way into is waiting for you to start moving toward it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today on the Soul Talk podcast. And if this conversation gave you a different way of thinking about movement, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel and join me as we continue this movement, this medicine series, and share this episode with someone who has been telling themselves they need to get back into shape. Maybe they don't need another person telling them to get in shape. Maybe they just need someone to remind them that their body still belongs in the world. And before you go, I want you to remember this. You don't have to be fast. You don't have to be fit. You don't have to be young. You don't have to look a certain way. You don't need a starting line. You don't need anyone's permission. You just need a next step. So take it. Walk to the corner, dance to the song, stretch toward the sky, take the stairs, run the mile, walk the mile. Move for 5 minutes, move for 50, whatever your body can do today. Meet it there. Because one day you'll realize that all those ordinary steps weren't ordinary at all. They were your life. So don't spend your whole life waiting to feel ready. Get up, step outside, take the next step, and go meet your life while you're moving through it. And again, thank you so much. Until next time, I'm Mary Beth Rim.